guys, how's it going? It's your boy Rixius, and for this stream, I actually want to get on a couple stories and begin a playlist set. So for this playlist, we're going to be reading a bit of stories from a collection of Edgar Allan Poe's works. To start out the first video of this collection series, we're going to be going over Berenice and Morella, or Morella, however you want to say it or pronounce it. So yeah, let's get started. I hope you guys are having a very positive day. All the good energy to you all, and I hope you get some good night's sleep from this. So let's do this. So today's beginning story is Berenice. Misery is a manifold. The wretchedness of the earth is multiform, overreaching the wide horizon as the rainbow. Its hues are as various as the hues of that of arch. As distinct, too, from beauty I have derived a type of hue and loveliness. From the covenant of peace, a similar of sorrow. But as in ethics, evil is a consequence of good. In fact, out of joy is sorrow. Born either the memory of the past, bliss is the anguish of today, or the agonies which they are, have their origins in the ecstasies which might have been. My baptismal name is Eugeus. That of my family I will not mention, yet there are no towers in the land more time-honored than in my gloomy, grey, hereditary halls. Our line has been called a race of visionaries, and in many striking particulars, in the characters of the family mansion, in the frescoes of the chief saloon, in the tapestries of the dormitories, in the chiseling of some buttresses in that armory, but more especially in the gallery of antique paintings, in the fashion of the library chamber, and lastly, in the very particular nature of the library's content. There is more than sufficient evidence to warrant the belief. The recollections of my earliest years are connected with that chamber, and with its volumes, of which lather I say no more. Here died my mother, wherein was I born. But it is merely idleness to say that I have not lived before, that the soul has no previous existence. You deny it. Let us not argue the matter. Convince myself I seek not to convince. There is, however, a remembrance of aerial form, of the spiritual and meaning eyes, of sound, musical yet sad. A remembrance which will not be excluded. A memory like a shadow, vague, variable, indefinite, unsteady, and like a shadow, too. In the impossibility of getting rid of while the sunlight of my reason shall exist. In that chamber was I born, thus awakening from long night of what seemed but was not, none untidy, at once into the very regions of fairyland, into a palace of imagination, into the wild dominions of monastic thoughts and erudition. It is not singular that I gazed around me with a startled and ardent eye, that I lorded away my boyhood in books, and dissipated my mouth in reverie. But it as years rolled away, and the noon of manhood found me still in the mansion of my fathers. It is wonderful, and stagnation there fell upon the springs of my life. Wonderful how total an inversion took place. The characters of my commonest thoughts, the realities of the world that affected me, as visions and as visions only, while the wild ideas of the land of dream became, in turn, not the material of my everyday existence, but in very deed that existence utterly and solely in itself. Berenice and I were cousins, and we grew up together in my paternal halls, yet differently we grew. I, ill of her health, and buried in gloom. She, agile, graceful, and overflowing with energy. Hers, the ramble of the hillside. Mine, the studies of the cloister. I, living within my own heart, an addicted body and soul to the most intense, painful meditation. She roaming carelessly through life, with no thought of the shadows in her path, or in the silent flight of the raven-winged hours. Berenice, I call upon her name. Berenice. And from the grey ruins of memory 1,000 tumultuous recollections are startled at the sound. Vividly is her image before me now, as in the early days of her lightheartedness and joy. Oh, gorgeous yet fantastic beauty. Oh, self amid the shrubberies of Arnheim. Oh, Naida among its fountains. And then all of its miseries and terror, and a tale which should not be told. Disease, a fatal disease, fell like the simoon upon her frame, and even while I gazed upon her, the spirit of change swept over her, pervading her mind, her habits, and her character, and in a manner the most subtle and terrible, disturbing even the identity of her person at last. The destroyer came and went, and the victim, where is she? I knew her not, or knew her no longer as Berenice. Among the numerous trains of maladies superinduced by the fatal and primary on which effected a revolution of a horrible kind in the moral and physical being of my cousin, may be mentioned as the most distressing upstatement in its nature, a species of epilepsy not unfrequently terminating in trance itself. Trance was very nearly resembling positive dissolution, and from which her manner of recovery was the most instances startling abrupt. In the meantime, my own disease, for I have been told that I should call it by no other appellation, my own disease then grew rapidly upon me, and assumed finally a monomatic character of a novel and extraordinary form, hourly and momently gaining vigor, and at length obtaining over the most incomprehensible ascendancy. This monomania, if I just so term it, consisted of a morbid irritability of those properties that of the mind in metaphysical science termed the attentive. It is more than probable that I am not understood, but I fear indeed that it is no matter possible to convey the mind of those merely general reader an adequate idea of the nervous intensity of interest with which, in my case, the power of meditating, not to speak technically, busied and buried in my case, the powers of themselves, in the contemplation of even the most ordinary objects of the universe. muse for long, unwearied hours with my attention riveted to some frivolous device on the margin or in the typography of a book, to become absorbed for the better part of a summer's day in a quaint shadows falling aslant upon the tapestry or upon the floor, to lose myself for an entire night watching the steady flame of a lamp or the embers of a fire, to dream away whole days over a perfume of a flower, to repeat monotonously some common word until the sound, by dint of frequent repetition, ceased to convey any idea whatever to the mind, to lose all sense of motion or physical existence by means of absolute bodily quiescence, long and obediently preserved in such were a few of the most common and least pernicious vagaries, induced in a condition of mental faculties, not indeed altogether unparalleled, but certainly bidding defiance to any like analysis or explanation. Yet me not misapprehended. The subdued, earnest, and morbid attention thus excited by objects in their own nature frivolous must not be confounded in character with the rumination propriety common in all mankind, and more especially indulged in by person by ardent imagination. It was not even, as it might be at first supposed, an extreme condition or exaggeration of a propensity, but primarily a essential, distinct, and different. In the one instant, the dreamer or enthusiast, being interested by an object usually not frivolous, imperceptibly lost sight of his object in a wilderness of deductions and suggestions, issuing therefore until the first cause of the musings entirely vanished and forgotten. In my case, the primary object was invariably frivolous, although assuming, though the medium of my despendent vision, they refracted in unreal importance. Few deductions, if any, were made, and a few of those particulars returning upon the original object as a second trait. The meditations were never pleasurable, and the termination of the reverie, the first cause, so far from being out of sight, had attained the supernaturally exaggerated interest which was prevailing features of the disease. In a word, the powers of the mind, more particularly exercised, were with me, as I've said before, the attentive, and are with the daydreamer, the speculative. My books at this epoch, if they did not actually serve to narrate the disorder partook, it would be perceived largely in the imaginative, inconsequential nature of the characteristic qualities of the disorder itself. I remember amongst other the tragedies of the noble Italian Coelius Secundus Curio de Amplifutien Appetito Regni de St. Augustine's great work of the City of God, and Tertullian's De Carne Coristine, in which the paradoxical sentence Mortis est diete filius, credible est que impenitium est, et sepultus resurrexit, cetrum ex quia impossibile est, occupied by my undivided time for many weeks of laborious and fruitless investigations. Thus it will appear that, shaken from the balance only trivial things, my reason bore resemblance to that ocean crag spoken by Ptolemy Hephaestions, which steadily resisted the attacks of human violence, and fiercer fury of the waters and the winds trembled only to the touch of the flower called asphodel. And although to a careless thinker it might appear that a matter beyond doubt that the altercation produced by her unhappy milady in the moral condition of Berenice would afford me many objects for the exercise, that intense and abnormal meditation whose nature I have been at some trouble in explaining. Yet, such was not in any degree the taking deeply to heart that total wreck of her and fair gentle life. I did not fall to a ponder frequently and bitterly upon wonder-working means by which so strange a revolutionary had to be so suddenly brought to pass. But these reflections partook not only of idiosyncrasy of my disease, and were such as would have occurred under similar circumstances to ordinary mass of mankind, true of its own character, but my disorder rebelled in less importance but not startling changes wrought in the physical frame of Berenice, and the singular and most appalling distortion of her personal identity. During the brightness of her unparalleled beauty, most surely I have never loved her. In the strange anomaly of the existence, feelings with me had never been of the heart, and the passion always were of the mind. Though the grey of the early morning among the trellised shadows of the forest, and the noonday and silence of my library at night, she had flitted by my eyes, and I have seen her, not as a living and breathing Berenice, but as the Berenice of a dream, not as the being of the earth, earthy, but the abstraction of such a being, not as anything to admire, but to analyze, not as an object of love, but as the theme of the most abstruse, although desultory speculation. And now I have shuddered in her presence, and I grew pale at her approach, yet bitterly lamenting her fallen and desolate condition. I called to mind that she had loved me long ago, and in an evil moment I spoke to her of marriage. And at length the period of our nuptials was approaching, when upon an afternoon in the winter of the year, one of the unreasonably warm and calm misty days, which are the nurse of the beautifully gaunt, I sat in the inner apartment of the library, but uplifting my eyes, I saw Berenice stood before me. It was my own excitement, or the misty influence of the atmosphere, or the uncertain twilight of the chamber, or the grey debris which fell around her figure, that caused it no vacillating and industry of an outline. I could not tell. She spoke no words, and I, not for words, could have uttered a syllable. An icy chill ran through my frame. I sensed insufferable anxiety oppressed me. A consuming curiosity pervaded my soul, and sinking back upon the chair, I remained for some time breathless and motionless, with my eyes riveted upon her person. At last, its fascinating was excessive, and not one vestige of the former being lurked in a single line of the contour. My burning glances at length fell upon the face. The forehead was high and very pale, and singular placid, and once jetty hair fell partially over it, and overshadowed the hollow temples in an innumerable ringlet, now of a yellow vivid, and jarring discordantly in their fantastic character with the resigned melancholy of the courtesans. The eyes were lifeless and lustreless, and the seamless pupilless, and I shrank involuntarily from their glassy stare to heed contemplation of the thin and shrunken lips. They parted, and in a smile peculiar meaning of the teeth of the changed Berenice disclosed themselves slowly to my view. Would to God that I have never beheld them, and that, having done so, I had died. The shutting of the door disturbed me, and looking up I found that my cousins had departed from the chamber, but from the disordered chamber of my brain had not at last departed, and would not have been driven away. ghastly spectrum of the teeth. Not a speck of their surface, not a shade of their enamel, not an indenture of their edges. But what that period of her smile had sufficed to brand upon my memory. I saw them now, even more univocally than I beheld them before then. The teeth, they were there, and everywhere, and visibly, palpably before me, long, narrow, and extensively white, with the pale lips writhing about them, as in a very moment of their first terrible development. Then came the full fury of my monomania. I struggled in vain against the strange and irresistible influence, and the multiplied objects of the external world. I have no thoughts but for the teeth. For these I have longed with a frenzied desire. All over the matters of different interest became absorbed in their single contemplation. They alone were present to the mental eye, and they, in their soul individually, became the essence of my mental life. I held them in every light, I turned to them in every attitude, and I surveyed their characteristics. I dwelt upon the peculiarities, and I pondered upon their conformation. Characteristics I dwelt upon, I mused upon, and I altercated their nature. I shuddered as I assigned them in imagination and sensitive and sensing powers, and even when unassisted by the lips, a capability of moral expressions of Mademoiselle Saye. It has been well said, que dos pas esta de pasements, and Berenice I once more seriously believed que dos de tens des ides. Here was the idiotic thought that destroyed me. Des ides. There before it has been convetted before so madly. I have then in possession God alone never restored me into peace, and given me back reason, and the evening closed upon, and dust and the darkness came, tarried in and went, and the day again dawned, and the mist of a second night were now gathering around, and I still sit motionless in that solitary room, and still sat buried in a meditation. That still phantasma of teeth maintained its terrible ascendancy, as with the most vivid hideous distinctiveness it floated about amid changing lights, and dismay that there were noto. After a pause succeeded in the sound of terrible voices, intermingled with many low moanings of sorrow and pain. I arose from my seat, throwing open the doors of the library, saw standing out in the antechamber a servant maiden, all in tears, who told me that Berenice was no more. She has been seized with epilepsy, and in early morning, and now closing off in the night, the grave was ready for its tenant, and all preparations for the burial were complete. I found myself sitting in the library, and I asked, again sitting there alone. It seemed that I had newly awakened from a confused and excited dream. I knew that it was now midnight, and I was well aware that since the setting of the sun, Berenice had been interred. But of that dreary period which intervened, I had no positive, at least no definite comprehension. Yet its memory was replete with horror more horrible from being vague, and terror more terrible from ambiguity. And I was fearful page in the records of my existence, written all over in the dim and hideous and unintelligible spirit of the departed world sounds. The shrill and piercing shriek of a female voice seemed to be ringing in my ears. I have done a deed. What was it? I asked myself the question aloud, and the whispering echoes of the chamber answered me. What was it? On the table beside me burned a lamp, and near it laid a little box. It was no remarkable character, and I have seen it frequently before, for it was the property of the family physician. But how came it here, upon my table, and why did I shudder in regarding it? These things were no manner to be accounted for, and my eyes at length dropped to the open pages of a book, and to a sentence understood therein. The words were singular, but but simple ones of a poet absent. Decebant me sodales si speculbrum, amice vestraerum, curas maes equilitium vorlabatas. Why then, as I pursued them, did the hairs of my head erect themselves on an end, and the blood of my body became congelated within my veins? There came a light tap of the library door, and a pale as tenant of a tomb, a menial entered upon tiptoe. His looks were wild with terror, and he spoke to me in a voice tremulously husky and very low. What said he? Some broken sentences I heard. He took a wild cry, disturbing in silence of the night, of the gathering together of households in search of the direction of the sound, and then his tone grew thrillingly distinct as he whispered to me in violet grave of a disfigured body, enshrouded yet still breathing, still palpitating, still alive. He pointed to garments. They were muddy and clothed with gore. I spoke not, and he took me gently by the hand and indented with me impressions of a human nail. He directed my attention to some object against the wall. I looked at it for some minutes, and it was a spade. With a shriek I bounded to a table and grasped the box that laid upon it, but I could not force it open, and in my tremor I slipped my hand and fell heavily and burst into pieces. And from it, with a rattling sound, there rolled some instruments of dental surgery, intermingled with 32 small white and ivory-looking substances that were scattered all over the fro and the floor. The end. That was the story of Berenice. Kinda nice how he started getting freaked out by teeth. Oh, the terror of teeth everywhere. Lovely little teeth, right? Now let's get started on Morella. It's gonna be a short story, but let's get to it. With a feeling of deep yet most singular affection, I regarded my friend Morella. Thrown by accident into her society many years ago, my soul from a first meeting burned with the fires it had never known, but the fires were not of Eros, and the bitter tormenting of my spirit was a gradual conviction that could know no matter define as their usual meaning and regulate their vague intensity. Yet we met, and fate bound us together as the altar, and I never spoke of passion nor of the love. She, however, shunned society, and attached herself to me alone, rendered me happy. It is happiness to wonder. It is a happiness to dream. Morella's erudition was profound, as I loved to live. Her talents were of no common order. Her powers of mind were gigantic. I felt this, and in many matters became her pupil. I soon, however, found out that, perhaps of an account of her Pressburg education, she was placed before me a number of those mystical writings which are usually considered to be mere dross of the early German literature. These, for the reasons I could not imagine, were a favorite constant study, and that in process they became my own, should be attributed to the simple but effectual influence of habit and example. In all this, if I err not, the reason had little to do. My convictions, or I forgot myself, were no matter acted upon in the ideal, nor was in any tincture of my metaphysicism, which I read to be discovered, unless I am greatly mistaken, either the deeds or in my thoughts persuades of his. I abandoned myself implicitly to the guidance of my wife, and entered with a unflinching heart into the intricacies of her studies. And then, when the poring over my forbidden pages, I felt forbidden spirit enkindling within me, would Morella place her cold hand upon my own, and rake up from the ashes of a dead philosophy some low, singular words, whose strange meaning buried themselves into upon a memory, and then hours after hours I would linger by her side and dwell upon the music of her voice until the length of its melody was tainted by terror, and there fell a shadow upon my soul. I grew pale and shuddered inwardly in those unearthly tones, and thus joy suddenly faded into horror, and most necessity to state the exact character of those disquisitions, which, growing out of the volumes I've mentioned, form for so long of a time almost the sole conversation of Morella and myself, by the learned in what might be termed theological morality, they would be readily conceived, and in by unlearned they would, all of the events be little understood. The wild pantheism of Flich, the modified Pelagialia of the Pelagiarians, and all the doctrines of identity as urged by Schelling were generally the points of discussion pressingly of the most of beauty to the imaginative Morella. That identity which is termed personal, Mr. Locke, I think truly defines the consistentness of rational being. And since by person we understand an intelligent essence having reason, and since it is consciousness which always accompanies thinking, it is this which makes us all be that which are call ourselves, thereby distinguishing us from other beings that think and giving us our personal identity. But the principum individualitas, the notion of the identity which art death, it is not lost forever, was to me at all times considered the most intense interest, not more for the perplexing anxiety nature of the consequences that from marked and the agitated manner of which Morella mentioned them, but indeed the time had now arrived when mystery of my wife's manner oppressed me as a spell. I could no longer bear the touch of her finger, nor the low tone of her musical language, nor the lustre of her melancholy eyes, and she knew all this, but did not upbraid. She seemed conscious of my weakness or my folly, and smiling called it fate. She seemed so conscious of a cause to me unknown for the gradual alienation of my regards, but she gave me no hint or token of its nature. Yet was she woman, and pinned away daily in the crimson spot settled steadily upon the cheek, and the blue veins upon the pale forehead became prominent. In the one instant my nature melted into pity, but in the next I met a glance of her meaning eyes, and then my soul sickened and became giddy with the giddiness of those who gaze downwards into the jury of my unfathomable abyss. Shall I then say that I longed with the earnest and consuming desire for the moment of Morella's decease? I did. But the fragile spirit clung to its tenement of clay for many days, for many weeks, and irksome months, until my tortured nerves obtained the mastery over my mind, and I grew ferocious through delay, and with the heart of a fiend cursed the days and the hours and the bitter moments, which seemed to lengthen and lengthen as her gentle life declined, like shadows in the dying of the day. But one autumnal evening, even when the winds lay still in heaven, Morella called me to her bedside. There was a dim mist over all of earth, and warm glow upon the waters, and amid the rich October leaves of the forest, and rainbow from the firmament has surely fallen. It is a day of days, she said, as I approached. A day of all days to live or die. It is a fair day for the sons of earth and life, and more fair for the daughters of heaven and death. I kissed her forehead, and she continued, I am dying, yet shall I live. Morella, the days have never been when thou couldst love me, but her home in life thou didst abhor, in death thou shalt adore. Morella, I repeat, I am dying, but within me is the pledge of that affection, how little, which thou didst for me, Morella. And when my spirit depart, shall the child live, thy child and mine, Morella's. But thy days shall be days of sorrow, the sorrow for which is the most lasting of impressions, as the cypress of the most enduring of trees. For the hours of the happiest are over, and joys not gathered twice in life, as the roses of Pastasium. Twice in a year thou shalt no longer then play in Tinian with me, but, being ignorant of the myrtle and vine, thou shalt bear about with thee thy shroud on earth, as do Australia Mecca. Morella, I cried, Morella, I knoweth thou this. But she had turned her face upon the pillow, and a slight tremor coming from her limbs, she thus died, and I heard her voice no more. Yet as she had foretold, her child, to which in dying she had given birth, which breathed not until mothered breathed no more, her child, a daughter, lived, and she grew strangely in the structure intelligent, and was the perfect resemblance of her who has departed, and I loved her with no love more fervent than I had believed impossible to feel for any denizen of earth. But ere long the heavens of this pure affection became darkened, and gloom and horror and grief swept over in clouds. I said the child grew strangely. Stature and intelligence, strange indeed was her rapid increase in bodily size, but terrible, oh terrible. Could it be otherwise when I daily discovered in the conceptions of the child adult powers and faculties of a woman? When the lessons of experience fell from the lips at infancy, and when the wisdom of the passion of maturity I found hourly gleaming from a full and speculative eye, when I say all of this became evident to the apparelled senses, that I could no longer hide it from my soul, nor throw it away off from those perceptions which I trembled to receive it. It is to be wondered at that suspicion of nature fearful of exciting crept upon my spirit, or that in my thoughts fell back aghast upon the wild tales of thrilling theories of the Tome de Morella. I snatched that scrutiny out of the world of being a whom destiny compelled me to adore, and in the rigorous seclusion of my home I watched with agonizing anxiety over all concern the beloved. And as the years rolled away, I gazed after day after day upon her holy and mild and eloquent face, and pored over her maturing form. Day after day I did discover new points in resemblance in the child to her mother. The melancholy and dead, and hourly grew darker these shadows, similitude, and more full and defined, and more perplexing, more hideously terrible in the aspects for which her smile was like her mother's. I could bear, but then I shuddered as it too perfectly identifying that her eyes were like Morella's. I could endure, but then they too often looked down in the depths of my soul with Morella's own intense and bewildering meaning. And in the contour of the high forehead, in the ringlets of the silken hair, and in the wan fingers which buried themselves therein, and in the sad musical tones of her speech above all, in the phrase of expression of the dead of the lips of the loved and living, I found food for consumption through and horror for a worm. Dost thou not die? Thus passed away 2 lustra of her life, and yet my daughter remained nameless upon the earth. My child and my love were designations usually prompted by a father's affection, and the rigid seclusions of her days preclude, and all other intercourse. Morella's name died with her at her death. Oh, the mother! I have never spoken to the daughter. It was impossible to speak indeed during brief periods of her existence. I latter had received no impressions from the outer world, save such might have been afforded by the narrow limits of her privacy. But at the length the ceremony of baptism presented to the mind, in the unnerved and agitated condition, a present deliverance from the tears of my destiny, and the baptismal font I hesitated for a name, and many titles of the wise and beautiful old modern times of my own and foreign land came throwing through my lips with many, many fair titles of the gentle and happy and the good. What prompted me to disturb the memory of the buried dead? What demon urged me to breathe that sound which in very recollection will make me ebb the purple blood in its torrents for the temples of its heart? What fiend spoke from the recess of my soul, when amid those dim aisles and the silence of the night I whispered within the ears of a holy man the syllables, Morella? What more than the fiend convulsed the features of my child and overspread them in those hues and death, as starting with the scarlet audacity audible sound, and turn her glassy eyes from the earth to heaven, and falling prostrate in the back of the slabs of our ancestral vaults responded, I am here, distinctively, coldly, calmly distinct, felt those few simple words within my ear, and then hence, like molten lead, rolled hissingly into my brain. Years have passed away, but the memory of the epoch never, nor, as I intended, ignorant of the flowers and the vines of the hemlock and the cypress overshadowed me in day and night, and I kept no reckoning of that time or place, and the stars of the faded from heaven, and therefore earth grew dark, and its figures passed by me like fleeting shadows, and amongst them all I beheld only Morella. The winds of the firmament breathed but one sound within my ears, and the ripples upon the sea murmured evermore, Morella. But she died, and with my own hands I bore her to the tomb, and I laughed with a long, bitter laugh, as I found no traces of the first in the channel where I laid the second Morella. Those were our two story pieces from the collection of Edgar Allan Poe. If you're really into this, there are some books that you can get at your local bookstore that you can get that has all of these collection samples. I really do like how it's actually pretty dark. If you actually read the stories, as you can see, this man had a quite peak interest of his wife, and then ended up hating her just to have a child that reminded him of her. It's ironic, actually, to the fact that he actually finally named her Morella. But I hope everyone has had a good time with the story. Definitely gonna start reading a little bit more and adding more to the playlist for Edgar Allan Poe's collection. Thank you for listening. I hope you guys have good energy, good vibes, and hopefully I've fallen asleep. Good night, everyone. Thank you for supporting the channel. Leave a like, a comment, and for all the new followers, welcome. Have a good night, everyone.